Welcome to the UN Brief. Today we interview Francesca Lessa. She is a professor at the University of Oxford in the Latin American Studies Department. We spoke about her book, The Condor Trials, about the concerted effort of several nations in South America to torture political dissidents. Thank you so much for listening and watching the UN Brief. And don't forget to subscribe. We bring you the latest about the United Nations, as well as news of interest on the history of diplomacy and emerging technologies. Thank you, and don't forget to subscribe. What sparked your interest?
So I was doing my PhD in London a few years ago, and that's when I became interested in issues of transitional justice, human rights, and accountability in the Southern Cone, especially Argentina and Uruguay. And when I finished that project, which was in late 2012, by that point, I had encountered indirectly the issue of Operation Condor, because of course it had come up as part of my previous project, but I didn't really have much time to focus on that in detail because I was already trying to devote quite a bit of attention to the two countries that I was conducting research on. So Condor was in the background, but that I hadn't had a chance to explore until 2012, which is when I finished my thesis, and then I turned it into a book. And at the time, one of the friends that I had met in Uruguay during different field trips and conferences told me that finally, after 40 years of waiting, her case was going to be included in a trial in Argentina that was due to begin the following year, so early 2013. And this trial was going to be the first trial looking specifically at the crimes of Operation Condor. And so when she shared that with that information with me, of course, for her was a very important moment because she had been searching for justice for 40 years. So finally having her case included in a trial was in itself a victory and an element of reparation as well. And in my case, it sort of sparked my interest again, reminding me of those of the information I had read about Condor in my previous project, and the fact that I hadn't had the chance to explore that aspect in detail. And it just was...
And your project was actually, your dissertation was Argentina and Uruguay, but broader aspects of its political history?
So yes, it was about the different ways in which the two countries had tried to come to terms with the legacy of the human rights violations committed during the dictatorship. So still related to the topic of Condor, but much more focused on the present and the ongoing struggle since democratization that had been taking place in those two countries, and trying to understand why and how countries that had experienced similar types of human rights violations and authoritarian regimes had responded in very different ways to the issue of accountability. So that was the focus of my dissertation and my first book. And so I feel these two projects are very much connected, and that the Condor research really builds on those years of research and fieldwork that I did for my PhD.
Yes, it is an incredible body of research. You have been very thorough. Also, you have seen documents that were classified and that are open to the public after a bit. So tell us a little bit, what was the process like of engaging in this very thorough research? What were the challenges in the beginning?
Well, there were several challenges. Well, the very first one was, of course, finding funds to be able to actually travel to Argentina and monitor the Operation Condor trial that began in 2013 and then lasted until 2016. So I was able, thanks to an initial fund from the University of Oxford, to travel there and attend a couple of hearings. Then a second challenge related to what you were saying about gaining access to some of these declassified documents, that although they are available, or they should be available in principle to the public, in fact, getting access to them is not as easy. Some of these documents are available online, but I would say that it's only quite a small minority of what is actually available to the public. And so again, this was the issue of being able to travel to a number of countries to physically access these archives that are the custodians, in a way, of this body of documents. And so as part of the project, I traveled to the United States to access many of the declassified documents that the National Security Archive NGO has been preserving, and they have been used in many of the trials.
So the documents are in Washington, D.C. at an NGO? No, at the National Security Archives.
Yes.
Or which?
So this National Security Archive is an NGO, although the name sounds a little strange.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is an NGO which is based within George Washington University. It's located there, although I understand is also independent of the university. And they are always involved in the declassification processes that take place of US government documents. And because they assist with those processes, then they are able to also keep a set of those documents, which are also available in some of the US government web pages, but they are more difficult to navigate at the National Security Archive with the advice of the different experts and analysts. It's much easier because some of the declassification rounds are 50,000 documents. So just navigating those and trying to understand which ones are relevant to you is a challenging job in itself. So I was very grateful to people such as Carlos Osorio, who helped me very much in navigating all the documents and being able to see which ones I should use. And then I also traveled to Asunción in Paraguay, where the archives of terror are located, and they are preserved in the building of the Supreme Court of Justice. So I also accessed some of the documents there. I also traveled to Brazil, to Porto Alegre, where there is a human rights NGO called Justice and Human Rights Movement that also has an archive relating to the work they have done in the past 40 years, helping many exiles fleeing from Argentina and Uruguay to Brazil. Of course, archives in Argentina, where I was based at the time, and in Chile and Uruguay. But in each of these cases, of course, there was a challenge of also gaining access to the archives, to sometimes negotiating with some officials that were not willing to maybe share everything that was available. And also, I guess, reluctant when they see a foreigner just landing in a country for a few days, and the perception that maybe I could travel there with a sort of extractivist mentality, just taking these documents for me and sort of not returning anything back with my research. So that's why I also always try to publish my work in Spanish, because I feel it's a way to show that, in fact, I do not have this extractive mentality, and that I want to actually make my research available to everyone as much as possible. So the second challenge is the ability to access archival documents for researchers, but also I think it's important to think about the fact that some of the victims themselves have the same difficulty, and in their case,
for the victims, it's even harder because you are emotionally involved, touched upon the issues. So it is a bit harder, I guess, to go through the process of reviewing the documents and seeing that, you know, tremendous injustice has been committed to your parents, to your grandparents, in some cases themselves, right? They're still alive. So the particularity of the Condor operation is because it's transnational character, right? You know, there was repression in each country. The police and the military were torturing people, killing people. But this was a concerted effort across the nations. And what role did the United States play on creating this transnational network?
So the United States, I would say, had a role in this coordination that was set up by the military dictatorship, but I wouldn't say that it had a creative role in the sense of being the party responsible for setting up Operation Condor, which is sometimes what we may find in some media articles or some reports on this issue. I think the role of the United States is much more complex and complicated than that, in the sense that, of course, if we look back at the geopolitical context of the Cold War, we know that Operation Condor has to be placed against this background of the confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union at the time. And of course, because of its geographical location, Latin America was physically located in what the United States would call its backyard. And so Latin America would fall under the sphere of influence of the United States. And of course, it was one of the sort of battling grounds of the Cold War, that we think it's a Cold War because there was no direct conflict between the US and the USSR, but in fact, there were many conflicts on the ground elsewhere, such as in the cases of the military dictatorships that were brutally fighting any type of manifestation that was associated with communism and socialism. And so the role of the United States in this context was multifold, because the first aspect was the ideological framing of the military dictatorships and Operation Condor itself, with the national security doctrine and this conceptualization that any form of political and social manifestation linked to communism constituted an enemy of the state and an enemy that was going to undermine national security, and that had to be fought at all costs. So the national security doctrine was the common ideological thread that united all of the military dictatorships in Latin America. Then we also had an actual element of training, because we also know that many hundreds of Latin American military and police officers received training at the School of the Americas in courses called such as counterinsurgency doctrine and counterinsurgency techniques, which we now know that were courses that then were used by these officers to interrogate and torture people when they were back in their home countries. We also know that many officials from the US were actually located in Latin America itself, training. There is a very famous case in Uruguay of a former USAID officer, Dan Mitrione, who in the late 1960s was training Uruguayan police officers in counterinsurgency techniques that were then used in the fight against the local guerrilla.
So they were basically training people to torture.
Yes.
We know nowadays that is the least useful way of extracting information. And in many cases, the groups that were manifesting against the dictatorship, they were not communists that were trying to kill people. They were not hardliners. They were socialists, so people who espoused the ideals of creating national sovereignty within their own countries in Latin America and the good of the people, right? They were not in any form or shape armed or trying to impose their views of the police in other people through violent means. So that is what is really terrifying, how they have managed to convince this group of nations, these military and these police officers, that these were the enemies in their soil and they were threats to national security. That's even more flagrant, you know, the extent of this torture and extreme violations of human rights law.
Definitely. And I mean, there were some armed groups and some armed guerrilla groups that were in their way attempting to undermine the state. But in fact, it was already clear at the time that the actual potential that these groups had was very, very limited. So they never really had the chance to bring about any downfall of any of these countries. But they sort of became a convenient excuse and provided a pretext to these military regimes to then have a major crackdown, not only on the armed groups, but also on all other social, political, and even labor movements and student movements that were brutally repressed. So the repression was then across the board against all of these groups. So just this very broad idea that the enemy could be anyone. So not only the guerrilla fighter, but actually a student that was fighting for student rights and even organized workers as well. So there was just a sweeping categorization that anyone that was going against the security of the state in any way then was an enemy that had to be eliminated effectively.
So you watched the trials in Argentina, and the Condor trials that took place in Italy were also in that period of time, and that were you there as well, or these were before?
So the two trials happened almost at the same time, which was slightly inconvenient given the distance between the two places. So I spent the majority of my time monitoring the one in Argentina, because that one began in 2013. So it began earlier than the one in Italy that began in 2015. So then I stayed in Argentina throughout the end of that trial. And by the time I returned to Oxford, the Italian trial was going through the appeals phase. So I was able to monitor the appeals phase that lasted between 2018 and 2019. And then also last year, when there was just one hearing in the final Supreme Court review of the case, I was also able to attend that two-day session in Rome, actually exactly a year ago, because it was the 8th of July last year that the review by the Italian Supreme Court happened. And then the following day, they released the verdict confirming all the life imprisonment sentences for all the remaining defendants by that point.
So why was it held in Italy? What took the Condor trials to Italy? And because the defendants were living in Italy, they had escaped the military who perpetrated these violations of human rights law?
So there were two main reasons. One, it's exactly what you said. One of the defendants had actually absconded from Uruguay, where criminal proceedings had begun against him in 2007. And so he fled the country to Italy, where his family was originally from. And so he's a double Italian Uruguayan citizen. So he was in Italy for some time trying to avoid justice. So that was one of the grounds. But the first ground, in fact, which dates back to the late 1990s when the case was originally presented, related to the fact that many of the victims had double nationality. So they were also Italian citizens. And because of the endurance of impunity laws throughout the Southern Cone at the time, the families had no opportunity to obtain justice in Argentina, Chile, or Uruguay. And so in their creative efforts to try and find alternative opportunities to obtain justice, the relatives of victims and human rights groups, using the precedent, of course, of the indictment of Pinochet in London and the opportunity to use courts in Europe to achieve justice, they decided to present a case in Italy, because Italian criminal law permits that the tribunals in Rome can investigate especially serious crimes that Italian citizens may have suffered abroad. And so because of this opportunity, these families from Argentina, Uruguay, and also Chile presented this case in the courts in Rome.
So they say justice delayed is justice denied. Have these victims found justice?
They have, and I was again very fortunate that I was able to sit in the courts on the day of the sentence and actually see and be with the victims and the human rights activists when the verdicts were read out. And in all of them, in both Buenos Aires and in Rome, it was always a moment of happiness, in the sense that of having been able to have achieved this objective of justice and to have had the recognition of the crimes against humanity that sometimes the victims themselves or their relatives who had disappeared, so it was the families fighting for justice for their loved ones, that they were able to achieve, that they were able with these verdicts also to completely dismantle the veil of impunity, silence, and denial that had lasted for so many years during the times of the dictatorship and the times of Condor, but in some cases well into democracy, because we had impunity laws valid across the region until just a decade ago. So it was, of course, a personal struggle for their victims, but also part of a broader struggle of fighting against this practice of impunity. And of course, there was always an element of bittersweet, because as you say, so much time had passed since the crimes were committed. And this long time is in itself also a denial of justice, and because so many obstacles had to be overcome to obtain justice. But I would say that at least my experience has been that it was justice, of course, maybe not the perfect justice that should have come much closer, but certainly a vindication that these crimes also are not subject to any statute of limitations or any time frames, that there's always a need and an obligation to investigate atrocities such as the ones that were committed, not only for the past in terms of redressing what happened, but also in setting the guarantees of non-repetition to make sure that crimes such as those never happen again in South America or elsewhere.
The obligations towards international human rights law, right, which countries are signatory of treaties. Now, just to wrap it up, what was different about Brazil, which surprises me, because Brazil sort of skirted the whole issue. They never brought anyone to justice. They sort of gave an amnesty, which sort of included the worst perpetrators of human rights violations. What was different from Argentina and Uruguay and Brazil in your research? Did something surface?
The case of Brazil is a very interesting and very puzzling one in a way, because we are still trying to unpack what has been different in that experience that has resulted in a situation where nowadays we still have complete impunity, because despite the efforts of many prosecutors such as Marlon Weikert in Sao Paulo and many others who have filed many cases in the country, the judiciary has always been very consistent in using the country's amnesty law that dates back to 1979 to systematically shelve all of the attempts to prosecute. There are a number of reasons for that. On the one hand, many scholars argue that because the time in which the crimes, well, the most serious crimes were committed in Brazil is concentrated in a relatively short time period between 1968 and 1972. And then there was a longer period of a protracted transition from 1974 until 1985. By the time the transition finally happened, the memory of those crimes was more distant than in the other countries. They also argue that the amnesty law of 1975 was actually the result of a campaign to liberate political prisoners and for them to receive an amnesty. And then that was hijacked so that the amnesty now applies to both the political prisoners, but also the military and police officers, with an understanding that that was a sort of a political decision in order to move on into democracy. There is also another explanation is related to the fact that some argue that the human rights movement relating to the time of the military dictatorship in Brazil has not been as consolidated as in Argentina, where we have some of the groups, such as the mothers and grandmothers of May Square, that are known throughout the world and have been leaders in accountability as well. And finally, another element also relates to what I was mentioning of this very slow transition whereby the military dictatorship was able to sort of transform itself in a new democracy, which however had many continuities with the authoritarian government. And so there were many obstacles built in on several levels: the political, the judicial, the amnesty law, and also a weaker human rights movement that I think help explain why Brazil has been such an outlier on these issues of accountability.
And now to finish it up, what is on your plans to promote the book and spread the word about this very important piece of history of Latin America?
So, well, many things will be happening over the next few months with the book. The book has been released now in English, but we also have a forthcoming translation in Spanish that will be released in either September or October, so in a couple of months, hopefully. And then we also have a translation into Italian that will also be released in December. So in this way, I'm hoping to make this research widely accessible to a number of audiences. I'll also be having two big book launch events in Oxford and in London in October, again, to publicize the book, and then try to do as many interviews as possible, such as this one with you, to enable the public to hopefully be interested in this research and want to learn more about it.
Yes. Thank you so much. Francesca Lessa from the University of Oxford. Pleasure speaking with you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for watching the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe